Mom, are you sure the Wi-Fi will work? I looked at Haley in the rearview mirror. Snuggled under a mound of blankets and pillows, she looked back at me through eyes as gray as my own. I'm positive, I laughed, as I answered the question for the 13th time. The tech should be there a few hours after we get there. She nodded and returned her attention to her game. I stared at the road in front of us, ready for the long drive to be over. We'd left New Mexico ready for a new start. Hopefully, going back to Black Claw would give us that. A second chance. My mind drifted to my time living in Black Claw. Some of my fondest memories took place there. Unfortunately, some of my worst were there as well. Talk to me, kiddo. I looked at her in the mirror again as she rolled her eyes. She grinned at the same time, and I knew she wasn't throwing me attitude. I didn't think the child had enough attitude in her whole body to make me mad. Keep my attention. She'd had a sweet, caring disposition since birth. Had made the eventual conversation we'd have to have about her father all the more heartbreaking. She knew we'd left him, but she didn't know the details. Eventually, I'd have to tell her. I told her brother about his father, about the age she was now, but she was so much more sensitive than he was at 8. I hesitated and kept putting it off. Why do you need me to keep your attention? She asked. Maddox, my son, shifted in the passenger seat and pushed his earbuds farther into his ears. I ignored him in favor of talking to Haley. He'd had a rough year and had been more and more closed off. Because I get hypnotized by the road, I explained, and it makes me want to fall asleep. You could let Maddox drive, she suggested. I shook my head. I'd rather drive myself. He can drive in town more. She shrugged. What are you looking forward to about living in Colorado? I asked. She pursed her lips and looked out the window at the trees rushing by. They'd already begun to turn from green to yellows and golds, even though it was still summer. Snow? Oh, good choice. I loved snow. I'd spent every summer in Black Claw with my grandmother, but my mother had also driven up the mountain for Christmas break as well. The mountains were always full of snow. I'd beg to go out, then knock on the door 10 minutes later, begging to come back in half frozen. Nana always had a mug of hot chocolate and tugged off my layers of clothing just to put them back on in a few hours when I'd asked to go play in the snow again. She had the patience of a saint. It'll snow before you know it, and we'll build a snowman. We can pretend he's real, she said, and I glanced at her in the mirror long enough to see her eyes twinkle. The merriment had faded the next time I looked. What if I don't make any friends? She asked. They might not like me. The school is small, I said, so the kids don't have a whole lot of other kids to play with. You'll be popular, I'm sure of it. I was sure. She'd made fast friends her entire life. Every time I turned around, she asked me to have a sleepover. I guess, she muttered, and went back to her tablet. I chuckled and glanced at Maddox. He was leaned against the window with his eyes closed, the ever-present white earbuds still in his ears, playing some metal or rock song or another. He'd gotten that from my ex-husband, who had been a big fan of music. I thought about poking him to get him to talk to me a while, but his year had been so rough that I wanted to let him rest. I also wasn't sure I was ready for a deep conversation with him. He felt so guilty about the move. His temper and demeanor reminded me so much of his father at that age, it made my throat close. His father had only been about a year older than Maddox when he left me, disappearing without a trace.